Larry swayed and coughed. Steve peered into his face. "What's the matter with you?" He clapped a hand to his chest, up near the shoulder. "Bullet, up high. Fernie's, but I got him. The big tramp." He laughed, and then became earnest again. "Get the girl. Beat it, now. Now! 10 minutes will be too late. They're coming." "Who?" snapped Steve. "What? Why?" The wounded man caught one of Steve's hands. "We're wasting time. But if you gotta have it, I'll give it to you. Izzard's a plant. The whole damn town. It's all to do with booze. The man I knocked off this afternoon, the one you thought was my father, originated the scheme. You make soda niter by boiling the nitrate in tanks. He got the idea that a niter plant would make a good front for a moonshine factory. More than that, if you had a whole town working together, it'd be impossible for the game ever to fall down. Ormsby took his scheme east and got his backing. A syndicate that could have raised enough money to build a dozen cities. Ormsby, Elder, and Brackett were the boys who managed the game. I was here to see they didn't double-cross the syndicate. And then there's a flock of trusty lieutenants, like Fernie and MacPhail. There was no trouble getting the population we wanted. The word went around that the new town was a place where a crook would be safe, so long as he did what he was told. The slums of all the cities of America emptied themselves here. There was never a bigger game, but it was too big for us. It went to our heads. At first, we played square with the syndicate. We made booze and shipped it out, and we made money. Then we got the big idea. Insurance. We kept on making the hooch, but we got the big idea going for our own profit. Elder managed it, with 3 or 4 assistants. Between them, they became agents of half the insurance companies in the country, and they began to plaster Izzard with policies. Men who never lived were examined, insured, and then killed. Sometimes on paper, sometimes a real man who died was substituted. And at times, a man or two was killed to order. You were with Camp the night he was killed. He was an insurance company sleuth. The companies were getting suspicious. He was foolish enough to trust his reports to the mail. We read them and sent phony ones out in their places. Then we nailed Mr. Camp. The insurance racket wasn't confined to men. Cars, houses, furniture, everything you can insure was plastered. Next, we sold stock certificates and bonds from one end of the states to the other. 100 corporations in Izzard that are nothing but addresses on letterheads. And these companies have built up a credit with manufacturers that make you dizzy to total. Then, bingo. The town's wiped out by fire. The stocks of goods are presumably burned. The expensive buildings that the out-of-town investors were told about are presumably destroyed. The books and records are burned. What a killing. And now, things are ripe. Next Saturday was the day we picked. That's the day when Izzard becomes nothing but a pile of ashes and collectible insurance policies. When the town goes up in smoke, there'll be hundreds of bodies found in the ruins, all insured. Proof of the death of hundreds of others, likewise insured, whose bodies can't be found. But the game was too big for us. We always weeded out those who came to town looking too honest, especially anybody doubtful who got into the post office, telegraph office, or telephone exchange. They flitted elsewhere in a hurry. Then, the telegraph company sent Nova here, and I flopped for her. The rest of them were all for giving Nova the works, but I told them I'd have her on the inside in no time. I really thought I could do it, but I didn't make any headway. The others got impatient. It wasn't easy to keep her from learning what was going on, but we managed it somehow. Then, with next Saturday, the day for the big fireworks, Ormsby told me flatly that if I didn't sew Nova up at once, they were going to pop her. They didn't know how much she'd found out, and they were taking no chances. I told him I'd kill him if he touched her, but I knew I couldn't talk him out of it. Today I heard he'd given the word that she was to be put out of the way tonight. I went to his office for a showdown. Brackett was there. Ormsby salved me along, denied he'd given any order affecting the girl, and poured out drinks for the 3 of us. The drinks looked wrong. I waited to see what was going to happen. Brackett gulped his down. It was poison. He went outside to die, and I nailed Ormsby. The game is blown up. He was too rich for us. Everybody's trying to slit everybody else's throat. Fernie tried to pot me from a window, but I got him. But I think this thing in my chest is the big one. The Elder will go through with the play. He'll have the town touched off tonight. It's now or never with him. He'll try to. A shriek cut through the darkness. "Steve! Steve!" Steve crossed the porch in a bound and was in the house. Behind him, Larry Ormsby's feet clattered. An empty hallway, a strip of golden light under a door. Steve hurled himself shoulder first at it and was in the room. Leaning back against a table, Dr. MacPhail was struggling with Nova Valance, who twisted and squirmed like a cat gone mad. In front of her, Mrs. MacPhail poised an uplifted blackjack. Steve flung a stick at the woman's white arm. The heavy ebony struck, and she staggered back. Dr. MacPhail, releasing the girl, dived at Steve's legs and carried him to the floor. Steve got a knee free, drove it at the doctor's face. Then he rolled over, got the doctor under him, raised his head, and snapped it down, hammering MacPhail's face with his skull. The doctor's arms fell away, and Steve lurched upright to find the fight over. Larry Ormsby stood in the doorway, grinning evilly over his pistol at Mrs. MacPhail, who stood sullenly by the table. Against the other side of the table, the girl leaned weakly, one hand on her bruised throat. Steve went round to her. "Get going, Steve," said Larry. "We'll go in my car. It can outrun anything in the state. Take Nova over to Blind Reimer's shack. I'll pick you up there. He's the only one in town you can trust. Go ahead, damn you." Steve glanced at the sullen MacPhail woman and her husband. "How about them?" "I'll take care of this pair. And be over at Reimer's with the car in 15 minutes. Get going." Steve's eyes narrowed and he studied the man in the doorway. He didn't trust him, but since all Izzard seemed equally dangerous, one place would be as safe as another, and Larry Ormsby might be honest this time. 5 minutes later, they were hurrying through the dark streets when a muffled shot came to their ears, and then another. The girl glanced quickly at Steve, but didn't speak. Reimer had heard and recognized the girl's footsteps on the sidewalk, and he opened the door before they could knock. "Come in, Nova." He fumbled for Steve's hand. "Mr. Threefall, isn't it?" He let them in, and Steve launched into a hurried summarizing of what Larry Ormsby had told him. The girl listened with wide eyes. The blind man's face lost its serenity as he listened. "If Ormsby comes with his car, as he said, you'll go with us, of course, Mr. Reimer. Tell us what you want to take with you. We'll get it ready." The blind man went to a wardrobe in the room's other end. "I've got nothing to take, but I'll get into warmer clothes." He pulled the wardrobe door open so that it screened a corner for him to change in. Steve went to a window, and the girl stood close to him, her fingers twined in his sleeve. A rifle cracked somewhere in the direction of Main Street, a volley of pistol shots. The cream-colored Vauxhall came out of nowhere to settle on the sidewalk, 2 steps from the door. Larry Ormsby tumbled out and through the door that Steve threw open for him. "Izzard's frying nicely," he cried and clapped his hands together. Steve turned to call the blind man. Reimer stepped out from behind his screening door, a heavy revolver in each hand. The film was gone from his eyes. Cool and sharp now, they held the 2 men and the girl. "Put your hands up, all of you." "I'm dying, Reimer," said Larry. "The hell with you." Without haste, he took a black automatic from an inside pocket. The guns in Reimer's hands rocked the cabin. Knocked into a sitting position by the heavy bullets, Larry steadied his back against the wall, and the crisp, sharp reports of his lighter weapon began to punctuate the roars of the erstwhile blind man's guns. Steve now hurled himself upon Reimer's flank, but just as he reached him, the shooting stopped. Reimer swayed. The very revolvers in his hands seemed to go limp. He slid out of Steve's clutching hands and became a lifeless pile on the floor. Steve went over to where the girl knelt beside Larry Ormsby. Larry smiled up at Steve. "That Reimer. Fooled us all. Phony film on eyes. Painted on. Spy for rum syndicate." His smile grew stiff. "Mind shaking hands, Steve?" Larry flashed another smile at him and died. The front door slammed open. 2 heads looked in. The heads' owners came in. Steve bounded upright, swung his stick. A bone cracked like a whip. A man reeled back, holding a hand to his temple. "Behind me! Close!" cried Steve to the girl, and felt her hands on his back. Men filled the doorway. An invisible gun roared, and a piece of the ceiling flaked down. Steve spun his stick and charged. The light from the lamp behind him glittered and glowed on the whirling wood. The stick whipped backward and forward, from left to right, right to left. It writhed like a live thing, as Steve and the girl went through the door. Between moving arms and legs and bodies, the cream of the Vauxhall showed. Swinging his stick, toppling men from the machine, Steve threw himself forward into the car. With his left hand, he swung the girl up over the door. Hands gripped him everywhere. Hands pounded him. He cried aloud with joy when he saw the girl huddled on the floor, working at the car's mechanism. The machine began to move. One of the girl's hands came up to grasp the wheel, holding the car straight along a street she couldn't see. A man fell on her. Steve pulled him off, tore pieces from him. The car swerved, scraped a building. The hands that held Steve fell away from him. Pistols exploded behind them. Then, the desert, white and smooth as a gigantic hospital bed, was all around them. A great sleepiness came to him. What a fight. What a fight. "Look at the sky," she exclaimed. Ahead of them, above them, the sky was lightening, from blue-black to violet to mauve to rose. "My mother has primroses in her garden in Delaware that look like that," he said. "You'll like 'em." He turned his head and looked back. Where they had left Izzard, a monstrous bonfire was burning, painting the sky with jeweled radiance. "Goodbye, Izzard," he said. His head slid over against her shoulder, and he went to sleep. McPhails were at home when Nova and Steve came through the flowered yard again, and they welcomed the girl with evident relief. The doctor was a short man with a round, jovial face. His wife was perhaps 10 years younger than he, a slender blonde. The girl introduced Steve, and then told them about the burglar and of what they'd found in the blind man's cabin. Dr. McPhail shook his head. Seems to me Fernie doesn't do all that could be done to tone Izzard down. Then the girl remembered Steve's wounded arm, and the doctor examined, washed, and bandaged it. Get it from our burglar? No, got it out in the street. A man named Camp and I were walking toward the hotel tonight and were jumped. Camp was killed. I got this. An asthmatic clock somewhere up the street was striking 3 as Steve passed through the McPhail's front gate and set out for the hotel again. He felt sore in every muscle. If anything else happens tonight, he told himself, I'm going to run like hell. I've had enough for one evening. But as he turned into Main Street, he found the cream Vauxhall stood near the corner, its owner at the wheel. As Steve came abreast, Larry Ormsby let its near door swing open and held out an inviting hand. Steve stopped. Jump in. I'll give you a lift as far as the hotel. Steve looked quizzically from the man's handsome, reckless face to the hotel, less than 2 blocks away. Then he looked at the man again and got into the automobile. I hear you're a more or less permanent fixture, said Ormsby, shutting off his engine. For a while. I also hear you had a little excitement tonight. If you keep up this pace, it won't take you long to nose me out of my position as Izzard's brightest light. Steve grinned and waited. The only thing I ever got from the old man, besides money, is a deep-rooted love for my own property. I don't feel that I should give it up, or any other rights, without a struggle. There it was. Now Steve knew what the talk was about. He was being warned off Nova Valance. Maybe you're right, said Steve, but I've never had enough experience with property to know how I'd feel about being deprived of it. Steve caught the wrist that flashed up and pinned it to Ormsby's side with a hand that much spinning of a heavy stick had muscled with steel. Easy, he said into the slitted, dancing eyes. Easy now. Larry Ormsby's white teeth flashed. Turn my wrist loose, he smiled. I'd like to shake hands with you. I like you, Threefall. You're going to add materially to the pleasures of Izzard. The pounding on the door awakened Steve at 9 o'clock the next morning. The pounder was one of Marshal Fernie's subordinates, and he told Steve that he was expected at the inquest into Camp's death within an hour. The coroner was a tall man with a sallow, puffy face, who sped proceedings along regardless of the finer points of legal technicality. Steve told his story, the marshal told his, and then produced a prisoner, a thick-set Austrian, whose throat and lower face were swathed in bandages. Is this the one you knocked down? Asked the coroner. Steve looked at the Austrian. I don't know. I can't see enough of him. This is the one I picked out of the gutter, said Grant Fernie, whether you knocked him there or not. I don't suppose you got a good look at him. I'd know him, said Steve. Take off some of his bandages so the witness can see him, ordered the coroner. Fernie unwound the Austrian's bandages, bearing a bruised and swollen jaw. Steve stared at the man. This fellow may have been one of his assailants, but he certainly wasn't the one he knocked into the street. Do you identify him? Asked the coroner. Steve shook his head. I don't remember ever seeing him. The coroner exposed broken yellow teeth in a snarl. The marshal glowered at Steve. The jurors regarded him with frank suspicion. The marshal and the coroner withdrew to a far corner, where they whispered together, casting frequent glances at Steve. All right, said the coroner when this conference was over. That's all. From the inquest, Steve walked slowly back to the hotel, his mind puzzled by this newest addition to Izzard's mysteries. At the hotel, he found that his bag had arrived from White Tufts. He took it up to his room and changed his clothes. Then he carried his perplexity to the window, where he sat smoking cigarette after cigarette, staring into the alley below. Was it possible that so many things should explode around one man in so short a time, in a small city of Izzard's size, without there being a connection between them, and between them and him? And if he was being involved in a vicious maze of crime and intrigue, what was it all about? He sprang to his feet. Down the other side of the alley, a man was walking. A thick-set man. A man with bandaged throat and chin. From what was visible, the face was the face of the man he'd knocked out. Steve ran down 3 flights of stairs and out of the hotel's back door. He gained the alley in time to see a trouser leg disappearing into a doorway in the block below. The doorway opened into an office building. He searched the corridors, upstairs and down, and didn't find the bandaged man. He returned to the ground floor and waited. 15 minutes passed. Then footsteps moved towards him. He shrank back, and they passed. A man and a woman laughing together. Steve peeped out. The checkered suit was unmistakable. College boy suit, Camp had called it. The man was Elder, the insurance and real estate agent. The woman was Dr. MacPhail's blonde wife. What next? Steve asked himself when they'd passed from the site. Is the whole town wrong? What next, I wonder? The answer came immediately. The pounding of crazy footsteps directly over his head. Above the noise of heels on wooden floor, a scream rose. A scream that blended horror and pain into a sound that was all the more unearthly because it was unmistakably of human origin. Steve bolted up the steps, pivoted into the second-floor corridor, and came face to face with David Brackett, the banker. Brackett's thick legs were far apart, and he swayed on them. His face was a pallid agony above his beard. From his writhing lips, thin wisps of vapor issued. "They've poisoned me, but damned." He came suddenly up on the tips of his toes. His body arched, and he fell stiffly backward, as dead things fall. As Steve dropped on a knee beside him, a shot crashed. He jerked erect and sprang down the corridor toward the sound. At the end of the corridor, a door was labeled Ormsby Niter Corporation, W. Ormsby, President. Even as he dashed towards it, another shot rattled the door and a falling body thudded behind it. Steve flung the door open and jumped aside to avoid stepping on the man who lay just inside. Over by a window, Larry Ormsby stood facing the door, a black automatic in his hand. His lips curled in a tight-lipped smile. "Hello, Threefall. I see you're still keeping close to the storm centers." Steve looked down at the man on the floor. W. Ormsby. He looked up from killed to killer. Larry Ormsby's eyes were hard and bright. Steve shook his head and heard the trampling of feet and a confusion of excited voices in the corridor behind him, and men came into the office. Grant Fernie, the marshal, was one of them. "Dead?" he asked, with a bare glance at the man on the floor. "Rather," replied Larry. "How come?" Larry Ormsby moistened his lips thoughtfully. "Threefall and I were standing down near the front door talking when we heard a shot. We came up, and just as we got to the head of the steps, we heard another shot, and Brackett came running out of here with this gun in his hand." He gave the automatic to the marshal and went on. "He took a few steps from the door, yelled, and fell down. Did you see him out there?" "I did," said Fernie. "Well, Threefall stopped to look at him while I came on in here to see if my father was all right, and found him dead. That's all there is to it." No one questioned Steve, and he left without either contradicting or corroborating Larry Ormsby's fiction. If he'd known what lay behind this piling up of crime, he could have decided what to do. But he didn't know. So, he kept silent. He couldn't grasp more than a fragment of the affair at a time now. Elder and Mrs. MacPhail going up the stairs. To where? What had become of the man with the bandages on throat and jaw? Had those three any part in the double murder? Had Larry killed the banker as well as his father? Nova Valance was sitting on the lower step of the MacPhail's porch when Steve went up the flowered walk that evening. She welcomed him warmly, concealing none of the impatience with which he had been waiting. He sat beside her, twisting around a little for a better view of the dusky oval of her face. "I suppose you heard all about today's excitement?" "Oh, yes. About Mr. Brackett shooting Mr. Ormsby, and then dying with one of his heart attacks." "Huh?" demanded Steve. "Suppose you tell me what you heard. All I really know is what Dr. MacPhail, who examined both of them, said." "And what was that?" "That Mr. Brackett shot Mr. Ormsby, though nobody seems to know why. And then, before he could get out of the building, his heart failed him, and he died." Steve caught her wrist in his hand. "Think now. Did you ever hear Dr. MacPhail speak of Brackett's heart trouble until today?" She looked into his face, and a little pucker of bewilderment came between her eyes. "I don't think so. But of course, there was never any reason why he should have mentioned it." "Why do you ask?" "Because," he told her, "Brackett did not shoot Ormsby, and any heart attack that killed Brackett was caused by poison. Some poison that burned his face." She gave a little cry of horror. Then she glanced furtively over her shoulder at the front door of the house. "Didn't you say that the man who was killed in the fight last night was named Camp?" "Yes." "Well, the report, or whatever it was that Dr. MacPhail made of his examination, reads Henry Cumberpatch. I saw it. What does it all mean?" The front gate clattered open, and a man swayed up the walk. Steve got up, picked up his black stick, and stepped between the girl and the advancing man. The man's face came out of the dark. It was Larry Ormsby. "You gotta get out. Get out of Izzard." He leaned back against the fence. "Your lives aren't worth a nickel. Neither of you." Finn's lunchroom was little more than a corridor, squeezed in between a pool room and a hardware store. Only one customer was there when Steve entered with his new friend, Roy Camp. "Hello, Mr. Reimer," said Camp. "How are you?" the man at the counter said. And as he turned his head, Steve saw that he was blind. His large blue eyes were filmed over, but it was a calm face, the face of a man at peace with his world. He was just finishing his meal and left shortly, moving with the slow accuracy of a blind man in familiar surroundings. "Reimer lives in a shack all alone," said Camp. "Supposed to have tons of gold coins under his floor. Someday we're going to find him all mamicked up." "A tough town, is it?" asked Steve. "Couldn't help being. It's only 3 years old, and a desert boomtown draws the tough boys." After their meal, Steve went back to the telegraph office. The girl was alone. "Anything for me?" he asked. She put a green check and a telegram on the counter. The telegram read, "Collected bet. Paid Whiting $200 for Ford. Sending balance $640. Shipping clothes. Watch your step. Harris." Steve leaned over the counter. "Now, listen, Miss Valance. I was all kinds of a damn fool yesterday, and I'm sorrier than I can say, but after all, nothing terrible happened. Nothing terrible. Is it nothing to be chased up and down the street like a rabbit by a drunken man in a filthy car?" She glared at him. Steve took his check across the street to the bank. The only man in there, a little plump fellow, came to the grill. "Can I do something for you?" Steve laid down the telegraph company's check. "I want to open an account." The banker picked up the slip of green paper. "Ah, you're the gentleman who assaulted my wall with an automobile yesterday." Steve grinned. "Are you going to stay in Izzard?" "For a while." The banker stuck a plump hand through the grill. "My name's Dave Brackett. Anything I can do to help you get established, call on me." That night, shaved and bathed, Steve, with his black stick beside him, played stud poker with Roy Camp and 4 factory workers. Prohibition didn't feature in Izzard. White-hot liquor was to be had at the cost of 50 cents and a raised finger. At 5 to midnight, the 4 factory men left for work, and the game broke up. Steve and Camp left together. They walked slowly down the dim thoroughfare toward the Izzard Hotel. Not 1,000 words had passed between the two men, but they had as surely become brothers in arms, as if they'd tracked a continent together. Strolling thus, a dark doorway suddenly vomited men upon them. Steve rocked back against the building from a blow on his head. Arms were around him. The burning edge of a knife blade ran down his left arm. He chopped his black stick up into a body, freeing himself from the encircling grip. He used the moment's respite to change his grasp on the stick, so that he held it horizontal. Now, the black stick became a whirling black arm of the night. The knob darted down at a man's head. Spinning back on its axis, the stick reversed. The ferruled end darted up, hit jawbone with a click, and no sooner struck than slid forward, jabbing deep into throat. The owner of that jaw and throat went backward out of the fight. Steve whirled in time to take the impact of a blackjack. The stick spun sidewise with thud of knob on temple. Then he saw suddenly that Camp had gone down. He battered a passage to the thin man. Behind his stick, that had become a living part of him, Steve Threefall knew that rare happiness which only the expert ever finds. The joy in doing a thing that he can do supremely well. Blows he took, blows that shook him, staggered him. But he scarcely noticed them. His whole consciousness was in his right arm, and the stick had spun. As abruptly as it had started, the fight stopped. Feet thudded away, forms vanished into the more complete darkness of the side street. And Steve was standing alone, except for the man stretched out between his feet. Steve knelt, lifted Camp's head from the bricks, and saw that his thin body was ripped open from throat to waistline. "Get word to..." The thin man tried desperately to make the last words audible. A hand gripped Steve's shoulder. "What the hell's all this?" The voice of Marshal Grant Fernie blotted out Camp's words. "Shut up a minute," snapped Steve, and put his ear again close to Camp's mouth. By now, the dying man could achieve no articulate sound. He tried, then he shuddered horribly, and died. "What's all this?" repeated the marshal. "A reception committee," said Steve, standing up. The others beat it around the corner. He tried to point with his left hand, then let it drop to his side. Looking at it, he saw that his sleeve was black with blood. "You better get that patched up," said the marshal. "Doc McPhail's is only 2 blocks up this street. I'll get in touch with you when I want you." Steve found the house without difficulty, a 2-story building set back behind a garden. 2 steps from it, Steve heard something and stopped. His right hand slid to the middle of his stick. Then, from the vine-blackened porch, a figure flung itself on his chest. "Mr. Threefall!" cried the figure in the voice of the girl at the telegraph office. "There's somebody in the house." "You mean a burglar?" He stared down into the white face upturned just beneath his chin. "Yes, he's upstairs, in Dr. McPhail's room." Is the doctor up there? No, no. He and Mrs. MacPhail haven't come home yet. He patted her soothingly on a velvet-coated shoulder, selecting a far shoulder so that he had to put his arm completely around her to do the patting. You stick here. I'll be back as soon as I've taken care of our friend. She clung to his shoulder with both hands. No, I couldn't stay here alone. I'll go with you. He bent to look into her face, and cold metal struck his chin. The muzzle of a big nickel-plated revolver in one of the hands that clung to his shoulder. Here, give me that thing, he said, and put it in his pocket. Now, keep as close as you can, and when I say down, drop flat to the floor and stay there. They went in, mounted to the second floor, and crept down the hall. Steve's outstretched hand touched the doorframe. Down, he whispered to the girl. Her fingers released his coat. He flung the door open, jumped through, slammed it behind him. A head-sized oval was black against the gray of a window. He spun his stick at it. Something caught the stick overhead. Glass crashed, showering him with fragments. There was a thud of feet on the roof of the rear porch. Steve sprang to the window in time to see the burglar making for the fence. One of Steve's legs was over the sill when the girl's arms came around his neck. No, don't leave me. Let him go. He got the gun out of his pocket, and as the fleeing shadow reached the fence, he squeezed the trigger. The revolver clicked. Again. Another click. 6 clicks, and the burglar was gone into the night. Steve broke the revolver in the dark and ran his fingers over the back of the cylinder. 6 empty chambers. Turn on the lights, he said brusquely. The place had been ransacked. Drawers stood out, their contents strewn on the floor. The bed had been stripped. Near the door, a broken wall light, the obstruction that had checked Steve's stick, hung crookedly. In the center of the floor lay a gold watch and half a length of gold chain. He picked them up. Dr. MacPhail's? The girl gasped. It's Mr. Reimer's. Reimer? Then he remembered. Reimer was the blind man who'd been in the Finn's lunchroom, and for whom Camp had prophesied trouble. Yes. Oh, I know something has happened to him. She put a hand on Steve's arm. We've got to go see. He lives all alone. The blind man's cabin was dark when they reached it, but the front door was ajar. Reimer lay on the floor, sprawled on his back. The room was topsy-turvy. Furniture lay in upended confusion. Clothing was scattered here and there, and boards had been torn from the floor. The girl knelt beside the unconscious man while Steve found an oil lamp. He got it burning just as Reimer's filmed eyes opened, and he sat up. He recognized the girl's voice at once, and smiled in her direction. I'm all right, Nova, he said. Not hurt a bit. He frowned with sudden anxiety, got to his feet, and moved across the room. Steve pulled a chair from his path. The blind man dropped on his knees in a corner, fumbling beneath the loosened floorboards. His hands came out empty, and he stood up. Gone, he said. Steve took the watch from his pocket and put it into one of the blind man's hands. There was a burglar at our house, explained the girl. After he'd gone, we found that on the floor. This is Mr. Threefall. The blind man groped for Steve's hand, pressed it. Then his flexible fingers caressed the watch, his face lighting up happily. I'm glad to have this back. The money wasn't so much, less than $300, but this watch was my father's. As the girl started to straighten up the room, he remonstrated. Run along home, Nova. It's late, and I'm all right. I'll go to bed now and let the place go as it is until tomorrow. The girl demurred. But presently she and Steve were walking back to MacPhail's house, through the black streets. They walked 2 blocks in silence. What's the matter? She asked abruptly. Steve smiled pleasantly down at her. Nothing. Why? There is. You're on your guard. You don't trust me. He tried a little of the truth. Just wondering, you did give me an empty gun to go after the burglar with, and you wouldn't let me chase him. Her hands fastened upon his lapels. Please, Mr. Threefall, you've got to believe me. I didn't know the revolver was empty. It was Dr. MacPhail's. I took it when I ran out of the house, and as for not letting you chase the burglar, I was afraid to be left alone again. I'm a little coward. Please believe in me, Mr. Threefall. I need friends. Womanhood had dropped from her. She pleaded with the small white face of a frightened child. It's been terrible. I came here 3 months ago because there was a vacancy in the telegraph office. The town, I can't get accustomed to it. It's so bleak. But I had to stay. There was nowhere else to go. Some people have been nice to me. Larry, Mr. Ormsby, persuaded the MacPhails to let me live with him. Mr. Reimer has helped me too, but I'm scared of everything. Of Larry Ormsby especially. It's as if there was something inside of him, waiting for something. I'm so afraid. It's a nightmare. whitened by desert travel until it was almost indistinguishable from the dust clouds that swirled around it, came down Izzard's main street. Like the dust, it came swiftly, erratically, zigzagging the breadth of the roadway. A girl of 20 stepped into the street. The wavering Ford missed her by inches, missing her at all only because her backward jump was bird quick. Her dark eyes flashed annoyance at the rear of the passing machine, and she essayed the street again. Near the opposite curb, the Ford charged down upon her once more, but turning had taken some of its speed. She escaped it this time by scampering the few feet between her and the sidewalk ahead. Out of the moving automobile, a man stepped. Miraculously, he kept his feet, stumbling, sliding, until an arm crooked around an iron awning post jerked him into an abrupt halt. He was a large man in bleached khaki, tall and broad. His gray eyes were bloodshot. Face and clothing were powdered heavily with dust. One of his hands clutched a thick black stick. The other swept off his hat. "I beg your pardon. If I hadn't been careful, I believed I'd almost hit you." The girl turned her small back on him and walked very precisely down the street. He stared after her until she'd vanished through a doorway in the middle of the block. Then he shrugged and turned to look across the street, where his machine had pushed its nose into the red brick sidewall of the Bank of Izzard, and now shook and clattered, as if in panic at finding itself masterless. A hand fastened upon his arm. He turned, and though he stood a good 6 feet himself, had to look up to meet the eyes of the giant who held him. "We'll take a little walk," said the giant. The man in bleached khaki examined him with wholehearted admiration. There were nearly 7 massive feet of the speaker. Legs like pillars held up a great hogshead of a body, with wide shoulders that sagged a little, as if with their own excessive weight. He was a man of perhaps 45, and his face was thick-featured, phlegmatic. "You're big," said the man in khaki. "Let's wrestle. Bet you $10 against 15 I can throw you. Come on." The giant chuckled, took the man in khaki by the nape of the neck and an arm, and walked down the street with him. Steve Threefall awakened without undue surprise at the unfamiliarity of his surroundings, as one who's awakened in strange places before. The feel of the shelf bunk on which he lay, and the sharp smell of disinfectant in his nostrils, told him he was in jail. His head and his mouth told him he'd been drunk, and his 3-day growth of beard told him he'd been very drunk. As he sat up and swung his feet down to the floor, details came back to him. The 2 days of steady drinking in White Tufts on the other side of the Nevada-California line with Harris, the hotel proprietor, and Whiting, an irrigation engineer. The boisterous arguing over desert travel. The bet that he could drive from White Tufts to Izzard in daylight with nothing to drink but the liquor they were drinking at the time. The start before dawn in Whiting's Ford, with Whiting and Harris staggering down the street after him, waking the town with their drunken shouts. He chose not to think of the ride. He'd won the bet, though, even if he couldn't remember how much it was for. "So, you come out of it at last?" inquired a voice. The steel-slatted door swung open, and the giant who wouldn't wrestle filled the doorway. His shirt was decorated with a shiny badge that said, "Marshal." "Feel like breakfast?" he asked. "I could do things to a can of black coffee," admitted Steve. "You'll have to gulp it. Judge Denvere is waiting to get a crack at you." The room in which Tobin Denvere J.P. dealt justice was scantily furnished with a table, an ancient desk, a dozen uncomfortable chairs, and half as many cracked and chipped china cuspidors. The judge sat with his feet on the table. They were small feet, and he was a small man. "Well, what's he charged with?" He kept his feet on the table. The marshal drew a deep breath. "Driving on the wrong side of the street, exceeding the speed limit, driving while under the influence of liquor, endangering the lives of pedestrians, and parking improperly on the sidewalk. There was," added the marshal, "a charge of attempted assault, too, but that Valance girl won't appear, so that'll have to be dropped." The justice's bright eyes turned upon Steve. "What have you got to say? Guilty or not?" "Oh, I suppose I did. That's enough. You're fined $150 and costs. The costs are $15.80, making a total of $165.80. Will you pay it, or will you go to jail?" "I'll pay it if I got it," said Steve. He turned to the marshal. "You took my money. Have I got that much?" The marshal nodded. "Exactly, to the nickel. Funny it should have come out like that. Huh." "Yes, funny," said Steve. The marshal restored Steve's possessions one by one, ending with the black walking stick. The big man examined it closely before he gave it up. It was thick and of ebony, but heavy even for that wood, with a balanced weight that hinted at loaded ferrule and knob. Not a bad weapon in a pinch, said the marshal. Steve took it with the grasp a man reserves for a favorite and constant companion. Not bad, he agreed. Steve Threefall went down the wooden stairs toward the street in as cheerful a frame of mind as his body would permit. He had escaped a jail sentence, and he counted himself lucky. He would wire Harris, the hotel proprietor in White Tufts, to send him some of his money, wait here until the Ford was repaired, and then drive back. "You will not!" cried a voice. He jumped, and then laughed at his alcohol-jangled nerves. The words hadn't been meant for him. Beside him, at a turning of the stairs, was an open window, and opposite, across a narrow alley, a window in another building was open. This window belonged to an office in which two men stood facing each other across a flat-topped desk. One of them was middle-aged and beefy, his face purple with rage. The man who faced him was younger, perhaps 30, immaculately clothed, with finely chiseled features and satiny brown hair. The beefy man spoke, a dozen words pitched too low to catch. The younger man slapped the speaker viciously across the face with an open hand, that then flashed back and flicked out a snub-nosed automatic. "You big lard can!" he cried. "You lay off, or I'll spoil your vest for you!" He stabbed the protuberant vest with the automatic. Then he pocketed the pistol and vanished from Steve's sight. Steve went on down to the street and unearthed the garage to which the Ford had been taken, and was told that Whiting's automobile would be in condition to move under its own power within 2 days. Next, he went to the telegraph office, pausing for a moment on the sidewalk to look at a glowing cream-colored Vauxhall Velux roadster that stood at the curb. In the doorway of the telegraph office, Steve paused again, abruptly. Behind the counter was the girl he nearly run down twice the previous afternoon. Talking to her with every appearance of intimacy was one of the two men he had seen half an hour before, the slender dandy who had slapped the other man's face and threatened him with an automatic. The girl looked up, recognized Steve, and stood very erect. He took off his hat and advanced, smiling. "I'm, awful sorry about yesterday," he said. "I'm a crazy fool when I—" "Do you wish to send a telegram?" she asked. "Yes," said Steve. "I also wish to—" "There are blanks and pencils on the desk near the window." And she turned her back on him. Steve felt himself coloring. He went to the table the girl had indicated, but he didn't immediately write his telegram. He sat there and studied the girl. Her face was an oval. Her nose just missed being upturned. Her violet black eyes just missed being too large. But in no respect did she miss being as beautiful as a figure from a Monticelli canvas. He wrote, "Henry Harris, Harris Hotel, White Tufts. I made it, slept it off in the cooler, and I'm going to settle here a while. There are things about this place I like. Wire my money and send my clothes to hotel here. Buy Whiting's Ford from him as cheap as you can for me." He carried his telegram to the counter, and the girl ran her pencil over it, counting the words. 47, she said. "Long," said Steve, "but I'm sending it collect." And he spun on his heel and left. One end of the bench in front of the telegraph office was occupied by a very tall and very lean man in rusty brown. "You ever been to our fair young city before?" he asked. "No," said Steve. "What's it all about?" "Soda niter. You scoop it up off the desert, cook it, and sell it to fertilizer manufacturers, nitric acid manufacturers, and any other kind who can manufacture something out of soda niter. The factory in which you do all this lies yonder, beyond the railroad tracks." "Suppose you don't play with this soda?" asked Steve. "What do you do then?" The thin man shrugged. "Depends on who you are. If you're Dave Brackett," he wiggled a finger at the bank across the road, "you gloat over your mortgages. If you're Larry Ormsby, and your old man owns the soda works, then you drive trick cars from across the pond," he nodded at the cream Vauxhall, "and spend your days pursuing beautiful telegraph operators." So, the dandy was named Larry Ormsby, and he was the factory owner's son. The thin man stood up. "It's lunchtime, and my name is Roy Camp. I'll be glad to have you face the greasy dangers of a meal at the Finns with me." Steve got up and held out his hand. "I'll be glad to," he said. "My name's Steve Threefall." They started up the street together. Coming toward them were two men in earnest conversation. One was the beefy man whose face Larry Ormsby had slapped. Steve waited until they passed. "And who are those prominent-looking folks?" "The one in the college boy suit is Conan Elder, real estate, insurance, and securities. The personage at his side is W.W. himself, the town's founder and owner. W.W. Ormsby, the Honorable Larry's papa." The scene in the office had been a family affair then, a matter between father and son. Steve, walking along with scant attention just now for Camp's words, felt a growing dissatisfaction in the memory of the girl and Larry Ormsby talking over the counter with their heads close together.